Which way do we go? Markets fight against a surging virus, and states delay their return to normal. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This week, Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina.
We were told by Chairman Powell, chairman of the Fed, when we passed the act, the $3 trillion may not be enough.
Contributor Larry Summers of Harvard. Dr. Marc Boom of Houston Methodist Hospital.
One of the unfortunate things we've ended up with is that, masks have become such a political issue. The reality is masks were one of the best techniques to allow us to open up the economy.
Contributor Afsaneh Beschloss of RockCreek Group. SEC Chairman Jay Clayton. General Stanley McChrystal.
We need to be the citizens that we believe citizens should be. How we treat fellow Americans, how we treat fellow people in the world.
And former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich. This week, we said goodbye to an historic first half of 2020, one that saw a pandemic sweep the globe and saw a recession put over 20 million Americans out of work.
This has been an enormous shock to the economic system. There's been much permanent job loss, factories that are never going to reopen, restaurants that are never going to reopen.
That saw civil unrest over systemic racism and brutal police misconduct.
That is an American problem. Equality before the law is as American as the flag.
And oh yes, an oil market that saw prices dip below zero.
As we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that finally the impact of lower oil prices will help the consuming countries.
But for all that, we also had an S&P having its best quarter in 22 years and surging consumer confidence. And then at the end of the week, we found out that we created 4.8 million new jobs last month. Another pleasant surprise. So what might the second half of an already harrowing year hold for investors? And can we really know where we're going until we find a vaccine that can put this virus behind us? We begin with those jobs numbers and asking ourselves, can we really tell much from them given the uncertain nature of the virus? We asked just that question of former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich.
The trend is certainly encouraging, at least relative to May and also April, but we are still 15 million jobs. And let me repeat that, David, because sometimes, the numbers just are overwhelming. 15 million jobs below what we were in February. So this little increase in jobs, that's good. It's better than not having it. But I also want to bring to your attention and to viewers' attention and listeners' attention that the Bureau of Labor Statistics survey was done before the current spike, the new spike in viruses in California and Texas and Arizona and many other places. And the real problem here is that the coronavirus is calling the shots, and it has to call the shots. People are not going to go into malls and take airplanes and do a lot of other things until they feel safe. And unfortunately, with this new spike, we are heading in exactly the wrong direction. We had yesterday 52,000 new cases. We have not had that many new cases in the United States. The record before had been 50,000 new cases. So if you have got 52,000 new cases in one day, which is more, let me just add, than Europe put together, well, you're heading in the wrong direction, not only in terms of the economy, but in terms of public health and public confidence, and all of the basic ingredients in what a good life should be.
And if you look at these jobs numbers, which, as you say, the trend is a nice trend, 2 months now exceeding expectations, a lot of the gains come in some of those areas that really are most susceptible to the reopening or the reversal of the reopening. So what is the smartest thing to do in terms of job creation in dealing with this pandemic?
Well, if you are an employee and you are furloughed, and you are getting paid and you are furloughed, you're in a pretty good position. If you are an employee and you can work remotely and you're getting paid to work remotely, you're you're fine. My concern is that you've got these two other very, very big groups of Americans. One who are essential workers, so-called essential workers. They are working in warehouses and factories and in meatpacking and in hospitals. A lot of these people are susceptible and are getting the virus in very large numbers in hotspots, and they are infecting other people. We are not doing what we need to do as a nation, not only in terms of contact testing and tracing, but also in terms of providing these people with adequate protection. And OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, of which I used to supervise when I was Secretary of Labor, they are not doing their job. They ought to be establishing national standards right now for maintaining distance at work, for masks, for sanitizers, for all sorts of other ways of preventing these essential workers from getting sick. You got the second group of workers we've been talking about, and that is people who are unemployed but also underemployed. We have across the country millions of people, about 4 million people who are getting paid less than they were paid before, because employers know that unemployment is very high and they can squeeze their workers. We've got about 6 million people who are working fewer hours than they were working before, even though they are still employed. We've got many, many millions of Americans who are working part-time, who'd rather be working full-time. They can't find jobs. And then we've got a final group, a very large group, estimated to be about 7 to 8 million people who are too discouraged even to look for work, or they don't want to look for work right now because they are understandably worried about catching the coronavirus, COVID-19. These people are counted. They are not even counted as unemployed, David. The Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't recognize this very large group of people too discouraged or not wanting to go to work right now as unemployed. Many of them, if they're furloughed, they're called back and they don't go back because they're worried about their jobs, they are not collecting unemployment insurance. And let me just add one other thing to this very disturbing brew, and that is that a lot of the states that had, in effect, moratoriums on evictions, those states are now ending their eviction moratoriums. The federal government has had in place an eviction moratorium on subsidized housing that ends on the 31st of July. Extra unemployment benefits end on the 31st of July, just a few weeks from now. There has been no movement in Congress to renew those, particularly in the Senate, although the House has renewed them, the Senate has not. And this is going to cause huge problems for people and a great deal of harm if these are not renewed.
Did we exceed what we should have done with the unemployment insurance by actually encouraging people not to go to work?
No. In fact, there's no evidence that we are encouraging people not to go to work. We have a hugely high rate of unemployment. It's very hard to get jobs. When you have a high rate of unemployment, when jobs are scarce because so many people are afraid to go into malls and shops and so many places are closed because of the coronavirus, it is not that the extra unemployment benefits are causing people not to work. Actually, what the extra unemployment benefits are doing is preventing families from going hungry and losing their homes.
That was Robert Reich of the University of California at Berkeley. Coming up, the epicenter of the pandemic has shifted to Houston, and we talk with the man running the hospital center on the front lines, Dr. Marc Boom of Houston Methodist.
We have to have everybody, and right now, frankly, with the data we're seeing, especially the younger population, recognizing that there is no way to get this under control unless everybody does their part.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. States that were among the first to reopen faced mounting COVID-19 cases this week. Texas had to reclose its bars, and Harris County, the home of Houston, declared an emergency because hospital beds were filling up. We talked with Dr. Marc Boom, head of Houston Methodist, one of the flagship hospital centers in the area, and he said that something had to be done.
In Houston, the virus is really spreading very rapidly, and we're highly concerned with that. So I want everything I say coming next to be clear with that unless we do something as the citizens of Houston, our leadership and others to stem this spread, we are very concerned about the trends we are seeing. ICU beds are really one of the core things that we measure when we look at how are we able to respond to this. And last week, there were reports that we were out of ICU beds, but they really came a little more from some, I think, misunderstanding of complex data that hospital executives, physicians, and others struggle with ourselves sometimes. Normally, we run about 90-95% occupancy, and we've been running about 90-95% occupancy in our ICUs. But the difference now is, of course, about 1 in 4 of those patients have COVID versus, a year ago where none of them would have had COVID. So we've already been making many adjustments to handle that. We have a lot of ability to upregulate and have additional ICU beds, but of course that's not an unlimited supply. And so we are working very hard with that, working very hard to manage that. But unless we bend this curve and unless we have people across Houston, really every single one of them locking arms and saying, I got you and we got you covered, and wearing their mask and social distancing and all the other things they need to do, frankly, staying home at this point, unless you need to be out of the home, we're worried that we're seeing very rapid acceleration of the spread right now based on the testing data that we see.
Give us a sense of the demographics, as it were, of the sorts of patients you're seeing coming in, and particularly in ICU having COVID-19. Is it similar to what we saw in New York? That is to say, it tends to be the elderly and people with underlying conditions, or is it changing? On Friday, once again, Vice President Pence suggested it's younger people now.
Yeah, that's correct. It is changing, and that's that certainly is a cushion a little bit to some of the dynamics, but it's not going to solve them. So in that first wave, we would see about 60% of people getting admitted or getting tested positive, rather, were over 50. Now we're seeing that completely flip, so it's 60% under 50. Back in that first wave, maybe 1 in 5 of our patients who were in ICU were younger than 50. Now that's rapidly approaching 1 in 3. So we're seeing a lot of very young people who do need ICU care. There's this misperception that, young people don't get sick. The average young person doesn't get sick, but if you have enough young people who are getting the virus, some of them get extraordinarily sick. We've had patients on ECMO. We've had a young mother who was on ECMO for over 2 weeks to save her life. We did, thankfully, able to go home to her baby after more than a month after she delivered. These are tough situations. And so we have to have everybody. And right now, frankly, with the data we're seeing, especially the younger population, recognizing that there is no way to get this under control unless everybody does their part.
Is the treatment also evolving? We don't have a vaccine yet. We don't know when we'll get one. There's a lot of talk about treatments. For example, remdesivir, we heard from Gilead, it's going to be pretty expensive to administer this stuff. How are you treating these people who really have severe cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, I think a cause for some cautious optimism, at least once somebody gets hospitalized, is that the outcomes have really improved a great deal. So mortality has gone down significantly, and it doesn't completely compute just with the age shift. That's a major factor. But we have learned so much. We've been caring for patients with COVID for over 100 days now. Our clinicians are smart. They've learned a lot. We were the first hospital in the country to use convalescent serum. And we've been very active in the remdesivir trials. And in both cases, we think those have been quite helpful. But there's a lot of other things that are more nuts and bolts, honestly. Proning, which means putting somebody on their stomach. It was a technique that had been used in the past for really sick people on a ventilator in an ICU. Now it's recognized really for patients who are in an acute care bed, so they're not so sick to be in ICU, and it's actually preventing people from deteriorating. So what we're seeing is, even though our volumes compared to the last peak are well more than double, our ICU utilization is up from that time, but not nearly as much. And I think we're keeping people out of ICU. The length of stay we're seeing is about 1.5 days shorter for people who do stay here. So those are some good good news. But the challenge is that in the community, this virus is spreading rapidly. And unless our community works together to get that spread under control, we are very concerned that many thousands of people could get infected, people will die, and the economy really will take a real beating again, as either through, incremental government orders, or frankly, just simply because the virus is, effectively disrupting organizations and companies and businesses' ability to function, that we will see significant negative economic impact in addition.
Dr. Boom, if you had your druthers, what would you want out of the government? And I'm talking about the state government with Governor Abbott, who was relatively eager to get things open back up, had to dial back on taverns, I think you call them. What would you like to see out of the governor? What would you like to see out of the mayor, out of the Harris County government to try to really curtail this?
So we were really grateful the governor shut down all bars across the state. I think that's been a really troublesome area. I mean, clearly we've seen young people, but I don't want to blame this all on young people. That's not really my point, but that's not a safe setting. I think there are some additional settings we really need to question right now. One of the things I'm very concerned about is the size of gatherings that are still allowed. I'm really concerned about the 4th of July. So when we look back at the data, really the thing that to me accelerated things so much in our community was Memorial Day. We saw people just sort of throwing caution to the wind, saying, hey, summer's here, we're going to relax, we're going to do whatever we want. We saw them cramming into swimming pools, cramming across a beach, having all sorts of barbecues. Nobody was protecting themselves. And that kind of, looseness has kind of continued. I think it's starting to shift back, thankfully, now, but it's not moved back enough. And I'm really worried that we're a few days away from the 4th of July. And, if Memorial Day was throwing a bunch of wood on the fire and in the early kindling, and that we've kind of been stoking for a while, we have the risk that a 4th of July could be like, pouring a can of gasoline. And so we really need to figure out how, we message that, our patriotic duty to each other is to keep each other safe, and we need to stay home. I mean, we need to celebrate the 4th of July with the people we live with in our household. Have a backyard barbecue with your own family or your household members and not with others, and watch fireworks from a car. Don't get out of your car. Stay home, watch, something on TV, but don't celebrate with large gatherings. We really need to keep people away from interacting with each other in that way, because I'm very concerned that'll accelerate the spread even more.
And we certainly need the community to participate, to comply with that. But why doesn't the government just order everybody to stay home? I mean, here I am in New York. They ordered us. Governor Cuomo ordered us to do it. It wasn't very popular, but he said for a period of time, you just got to stay home and stay with your family. Why don't they do that in Houston? Why don't they do that in Texas?
Well, it's kind of above my pay grade, one of those things. I mean, we obviously have been in a regular conversation with all government leaders about what the situation on the ground, where we are. I mean, the good news is the hospitals are managing this so far. The bad news is the virus is spreading very rapidly in our community, and we need very consistent messaging from all levels of government, all of the press. One of the unfortunate things we've ended up with is that, masks have become such a political issue. The reality is masks were one of the best techniques to allow us to open up the economy. And unfortunately, this dialogue started that said they weren't the right thing. They are most emphatically the right thing to do right now. And we need everybody wearing a mask when they do go out.
That was Dr. Marc Boom, head of Houston Methodist Hospital. Coming up, fighting the economic effects of the coronavirus through government stimulus. We talk with Jim Clyburn, chairman of the Select House Committee overseeing CARES Act funding.
I don't have a thing to do with sending the money out, but I do have a lot to do with oversight of how the money went out, where it went, how it was spent, and who got the benefit.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Congress has already appropriated over $2 trillion to support the economy, and yet everybody agrees that's not going to be enough. But is the money that has been appropriated getting to the people who need it the most? We talked with the third-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives, Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, and he said that at least initially, the proper safeguards were not in place.
The first CARES Act? No, we did not. We did not put the protections in there that needed to be in there in order to make sure that the money's got to where they were really needed, make sure the money got to small businesses, down to Main Street, and also on the paycheck protection part, whether or not people working in these smaller businesses were able to get their paychecks protected. I hear from people today that still have not received their monies. So there is some efficiency problems with that. As it relates to the second CARES package, what we call the emergency bill, we did put protections in there. And we allowed for community development, financial institutions, for credit unions to participate, because so many of these small businesses do their banking with these entities. They aren't non-banked, as people say. They just don't bank with the big corporations. So the protections are there. So now we're hearing that there's $130, $140 billion that is not going out of the door. I'm not too sure that they don't need to go out of the door. The question is whether or not we are focusing on Main Street in order to get that done.
So, Congressman, who's going to decide on that? I think I read it was $134 billion. You say $130, $140 billion under the PPP, the Payroll Protection Act, hasn't gone out the door. Who's going to decide who gets that money?
Well, it's always been up to the Small Business Administration and to the Treasury Department to make those decisions. My job as chair of the Oversight Committee is to step in to see whether or not what they decided to do meet my three-pronged test. Number one, was it done efficiently? Number two, was it done effectively? And number three, was it done equitably? So that's where I come into the equation. I don't have a thing to do with sending the money out, but I do have a lot to do with oversight of how the money went out, where it went, how it was spent, and who got the benefit.
So, Congressman, that's the money that's already been appropriated. There's a lot of talk that this month, in the month of July, we're going to have another round of fiscal stimulus. Do you expect there to be another round? How big will it be?
Well, we were anticipating that. The Speaker Pelosi made it very clear. That's why we passed the HEROES Act, $3 trillion. And a lot of people recalled at that number, but we were told by Chairman Powell, Chairman of the Fed, when we passed the act, the $3 trillion may not be enough. So the fact of the matter is the House has done its job. We have protected local, state and local governments, almost $1 trillion appropriated for them. It's now time for Mitch McConnell to do his job. Walk out of that graveyard and pass this legislation that we have sent to them. He may not want all of it, but I think he owes it to the American people to look at that expenditure and do what is necessary for people to stay vibrant in this economy.
Yeah, he may well owe it to the American people. Also, there are elections coming up in November. Is there some pressure on both Republicans and Democrats to really get some stimulus, given the fact we still have something like 20 million people unemployed in this country?
Yes, we do. And of course, we on the House side can do our jobs. There's very little that we can do to make the Senate do its job. I would hope that Mitch McConnell would wise up. And if not, I hope the people of Kentucky will wake up.
That was Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Coming up, ESG investing in the time of COVID-19. We talk with contributor Afsaneh Beschloss of RockCreek Group.
You have seen a lot of money go into the health sector, and it's not seen as just something that you're throwing away. It's actually seen as some of the highest return areas for investment.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Socially responsible investing is gaining more traction during the COVID-19 pandemic and as the world confronts racial inequities. ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors, help investors screen potential investments in companies. Flows into U.S. and Europe-listed ESG funds for the year have already exceeded 2019 figures.
Investors have begun to see and identify that the best governed companies, the ones that are protecting the environment, and especially the ones that are very conscious of their social issues and their human capital issues, have outperformed.
Stay-at-home orders around the world kept people off the roads and cut carbon emissions more than any other event in the last century.
From 2006 to last year, we reduced our footprint by 15%. So by 2030, we're going to try to reduce our footprint by another 15%. I think we've got a good line on how to do that.
Impact investing also looks at diversity. Corporations began pledging efforts to close the racial divide after the killing of George Floyd.
I think COVID is going to elevate, and the associated large issues around racial inequality is going to raise a whole issue of S. And so I believe the demands on public companies, public boards and CEOs, hopefully private companies, are going to be all elevated.
Black directors make up only 1% of board members of S&P 500 companies, and 37% of boards don't have any black members at all.
We need to incentivize boards to increase diversity. We need to incentivize CEOs to ensure that their C-suites are diverse. And we do that because this is a market, and market has investors.
Wall Street Week contributor Afsaneh Beschloss, CEO of RockCreek Group, uses ESG to screen her own investments.
Social has become very important because everybody, every family, every person is involved with their health crisis and their financial crisis. And their health crisis, they're seeing that the coming together of technology and telemedicine, but also technology and the huge data that has allowed us to move towards a vaccine and towards a treatment for this COVID-19 has been so interesting, so different than the development of any other vaccine. And we're seeing there are a lot of announcements the last couple of days about the social part being actually the part that has been getting capital. So you have seen a lot of money go into the health sector by very sophisticated investors. And it's not seen as just something that you're throwing away. It's actually seen as some of the highest return areas for investment.
Is there enough reporting from publicly traded companies to really give investors an accurate read on their rating on environment, on social that you've just been talking about as a governance? Because that seems to be a problem. There's no uniformity. Is there of reporting?
So at RockCreek, what we realized is that if you look at let's say the Bloomberg indicators, or you look at MSCI, or look at the RockCreek ones, they're all going to end up in different places. So we came up with a technology that is basically going to look at each of these factors and rate using the different rating systems. So if you use the Bloomberg system that has done a lot on sustainability, we can apply the technology and use those factors. We can use our own factors because, as you said, there is, as of today, no one agreed upon methodology and not one agreed upon way of measuring impact when it comes to either social or even the governance part of this. The part that is very easy to measure, obviously, is the environmental part. Then it's the governance part to some extent, but that has some sort of cushy areas that are harder to measure. And then obviously the social is the hardest. But I can tell you, I was doing social shadow pricing in the 1990s at the World Bank, and it is still very relevant. And you can use some of that methodology for coming up with social measurements.
And finally, Afsaneh, one other item that you raised in your note, and that is the apparent, if it's a word, de-urbanization. People really increasingly moving away from cities because of various factors, even before COVID-19, certainly exacerbated here. What does that say to investors? What does that make more attractive for an investor?
So I think housing has been a big problem for all of us. So if you look at housing, most of the money that has gone into housing has gone into luxury housing, and very little has gone into affordable housing. And that has resulted in major problems in cities where the supply of affordable housing has gone down, and also housing even for middle-income families, such as firefighters, people who are fighting for us on the front lines, teachers, has not really been available and has taken more than half of their income. So you're finding both the economic effects of inequality that we've been talking about, as well as the fact that COVID is telling you do need to social distance. You saw that density of population leads to more disease, is pushing people. And that has led to huge number of new contracts in housing.
Afsaneh Beschloss may use ESG in screening her own investments, but SEC Chairman Jay Clayton has some doubts about whether there's any single metric that really will work.
There is something that troubles me, David. You and I have talked about this, and that is lumping E, S, and G together. They're very different considerations, and it particularly troubles me when there's one overall ESG rating. I'm going to go back to my study of economics days. Ken Arrow won the Nobel Prize for a body of work, but one thing was that ordering preferences in that way doesn't really work. It's particularly hard when you order preferences against things that are unrelated to each other. So a single ESG score, I'm highly skeptical of whether that gives investors information that they need to make the kind of investment decision that they want. And I've invited portfolio managers, and I want to hear from people who look rigorously at these issues and allocate capital accordingly as to how we can better guide investors as to what's an effective way to look at an investment decision in this area.
Well, I certainly am not one to argue with Ken Arrow, for goodness sakes, because I'm not that good. But let me focus on one specific, and that's social. Because in the midst of this pandemic and the shutdown, that has come to the forefront. And a lot of the discussions that say, really, we want to invest in a company that is a proper citizen, treats their employees well, treats their communities well, and is really supported by that, but that is a better investment. Is there a way of measuring or comparing social across companies?
Let me say two things. I think, in my experience, David, and I've been lucky enough to see a lot of really well-run companies. I haven't seen a really well-run company that did not have its employees and other constituencies front of mind. How are we developing our employees so that they're better, a company can be better, and the like. But for each sector, that's a very different analysis.
That was SEC Chairman Jay Clayton. Next on Wall Street Week, retired General Stanley McChrystal on leadership in a time of crisis such as we face now.
We need to be thinking about a leader who pulls a team together, team around them to govern, and then a team of the United States.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
What kind of people do these beasts think we are? And what kind of people are we really at the dawn of the 21st century? These are the questions so many Americans answered heroically this week, and that the nation will be answering more fundamentally in the coming days and indeed the coming century, humanly, militarily, and economically.
That was Louis Ruckhiser on Wall Street Week back on September 14, 2001. Retired General Stanley McChrystal has seen his fair share of leadership challenges during time of crisis, including when he was commander of national security forces in Afghanistan.
I think what we need, I'll start with followers, is we need to be the citizens that we believe citizens should be, how we treat fellow Americans, how we treat fellow people in the world. We need to be the followers we would like to have if we were in a leadership position. We need to understand that sometimes things are hard, and they're hard for everybody, and we've got to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and move forward. I think we have a tendency to be selfish sometimes. I think we have a tendency to be myopic, and that is beneath the American character. I think we are better than that. I know we are better than that, and we can do it. What kind of leadership do we need to do that? We don't need a particularly anointed person as leader. The woman or man that leads the United States doesn't have to be brilliant, doesn't have to have all the answers. They have to have two things. They have to have character, and I call that the amalgamation of values, integrity, steadiness. And they have to have judgment. They have to be able to surround themselves with people better informed and smarter than they are that can influence them toward the right outcome. No one person's going to walk in with all the answers or solutions. That's just not realistic. And when you study history, it's never been the case, although we sometimes want to cast it in that light. So I think we need to be thinking about a leader who pulls a team together, team around them to govern, and then a team of the United States. You know, as bad as COVID-19, it's an extraordinary opportunity. It's an external threat facing every country in the world essentially the same way. It ought to be the most unifying pressure we've ever gotten because it's a them that we don't have to hate. We can use it to unify ourselves. We can use it to galvanize people into action. The things like the economic challenges that it creates are also things that we should roll up our sleeves and say, these are hard, but we will work our way through them. So I actually think it ought to be an opportunity for us to show us who we are to ourselves, who we are, and for leaders to stand up and ask us to do that.
So, General McChrystal, you refer to history, and I think there's a tendency to look back over American history and say, we've had some pretty bad crises before, but there has been some outstanding leader that stepped up. FDR during World War II, Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, the Founding Fathers, you could name them, back during the Revolution. As we approach our nation's birthday here, is that putting too much pressure on individuals at this point? Do we need an Abraham Lincoln, an FDR, George Washington right now to pull us through this?
Well, if you looked at Abraham Lincoln's career before his election in 1860, it was not that impressive, one-term congressman. If you look at Franklin Roosevelt, although governor of New York, in many ways he wasn't taken seriously by many people in the Democratic Party or the world. And the point I'm making is often the circumstances in which they are put make the person.
That was General Stanley McChrystal of the McChrystal Group. Coming up, special contributor Larry Summers takes us through the history we've made in the first 6 months of 2020. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Historic is a word that's used too freely. But the first half of 2020 will most certainly go down in the history books. To give us some perspective, we asked special contributor Larry Summers of Harvard for his take on what that history will look like.
The first 6 months of 2020 are likely to be in the history books. Most 6-month periods don't get in the history books. Who knows what some history book will say about the first half of 2014 or the second half of 2007. They will talk about the second half of 1941. They will talk about the second half of 2001. They will talk about the second half of 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. And I think they'll talk about this period. They'll talk about this period because COVID will be a very big story. They may talk about it because of the transformational events in American politics. They may talk about it because of what's happening in China. But I think there's a good chance that this last 6 months will be in the history books, not to mention the financial history books, given that you saw central banks do things that central banks had never before done in history. You saw them do it in almost every major country.
The thing that puts us in history books often is extreme adversity. You have an assassination of a president, you have the beginning of a war, you have a terrorist attack. Certainly we have that here with the pandemic followed by the economic crisis. But the real question then becomes, how do we respond to that extreme adversity? What do you think the history books will say about how we've responded?
There's what I fear and there's what I hope. Let me tell you first about what I fear. What I fear is that this will be the moment when the baby boomer generation lost the American century. That above all, the spectacle of spectacular incompetence in the basics of national security, protecting the American people from a threat, not just to their livelihoods, but to their lives, that will be lost. Because the United States, the once can-do nation, will have one of the worst records in dealing with a threat that faced everybody around the world. That's what you heard when you heard Anthony Fauci this week talk about our case count potentially going from 40,000 to 100,000 cases a day. And by the way, since people think we're understating the number of cases by a factor of 10, that 100,000 cases a day is potentially close to 1 million actual and real cases a day. That's a very, very big deal. It affects the American people's confidence in themselves and their ability to do anything else. It affects the economy. If people are fearful of being near other people, it doesn't matter about shutdown orders. You're not going to have a decent economy. It affects the standing of the United States in the world and emboldens our potential adversaries. It affects the credibility of our democratic, market-oriented model. If we're not able to manage our own affairs in a competent way within our democratic system, it is something whose full consequences, I think, are very hard to predict, but we know they will mean much less good lives for our children through their adulthood and ultimately for our grandchildren. And that's on the table. I'm not predicting it, but that is on the table right now.
And Larry, if that's the downside case, what's the upside case?
I think what I hope for is that this will be a period of renewal. You know, if you look at the long arc of American history, our great strength is our ability to be resilient. For there to be prophecies of doom, and for those prophecies to prove to be self-denying because they mobilize energy that prompts renewal. That was the story around the Civil War. That was the story around the fears that we would lose the Cold War. That was what happened when people thought we had a malaise and declared a crisis of the national spirit in the late 1970s. That's what prompted, it's at least said, Winston Churchill to have remarked that the United States always does the right thing, but only after exhausting the alternatives. And certainly in the United States, whether it is repairing the potholes in the roads, whether it is improving education, whether it is providing health care for everyone so that they can feel secure, there is low-hanging fruit. There are problems that are not intractable, very much the opposite, subject to effective resolution. And if we can return to a culture of rational argument, of considered leadership, I think that with all of our problems, with every problem the United States has, playing the hand of the United States is probably the best hand to play of major countries in the world. So I am fearful, yes, but I also see great potential in this moment.
Larry, you said something I think critically important just there, depending on rational judgment and considered leadership. In the past, when the United States has faced some historic crises, we've prided ourselves in the ability to bring the best minds into the room, really dealing with the facts, not wishing ourselves to success, having a media that can screen through some of the subterfuge and really get to the truth. Do we have those tools available to us today the way we have in the past?
There's some tendency like that in the way we allocate our attention to the most exciting thing, to clickbait, rather than to substance. And there's a lot of cultural, very large questions there. There's questions of regulation, who's a publisher and who's a platform that we're going to face. But ultimately, I think it's a great deal about providing the right kind of vision to people. And a great deal of this, I think, is the responsibility of our schools and our universities. And I think that Daniel Patrick Moynihan said something very profound when he said, "You're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts." And what I, as an educator, worry about is that in our rush to tolerance, we're stopping teaching that.
Long before the pandemic, you were very concerned about secular stagnation. We were having trouble with fundamental growth. If we get the sort of renewal that your hopeful case posits, could that also apply to the economy, to growth, to the future of our children and our grandchildren?
Keynes said something very powerful when he spoke of the animal spirits of business. And I think that whether people feel like the country is going in the right direction, that more than the interest rate or more than some LIBOR spread determines what kind of investment our businesses make in the future, determines what kind of willingness there is for the most able foreigners to come to our shores. It determines the extent to which young Americans invest in their own futures. And so I think ultimately a sense of confidence in our national project is something that's very important.
Finally, one more thought. The rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. This week marked the 244th anniversary of the United States of America, something we celebrated the first time in 1777 when ships' cannons in Philadelphia Harbor fired 13 times, once for each of the colonies. That's a tradition that grew into the fireworks displays that we know so well, ones that cost some $1 billion last year. This year will be different, including for the fireworks, because concerns over social distancing have caused some 80% of all municipalities across the country to cancel their fireworks displays.
We continue to urge you to stay at home or near your home for this year's celebration.
The iconic celebration in Boston with the Boston Pops Orchestra goes forward as usual, with the 1812 Overture and that spectacular fireworks display over Boston Harbor. It's just that this year, it's all virtual. But however we celebrate it, it is once again America, the home of the brave. Just that this year, we're thinking of the brave men and women fighting on the front lines of the pandemic, fighting to keep us all safe. That does it for this episode of Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. This is Bloomberg. See you next week.